it's just 6 o'clock. I do believe we may have 1 or 2 people still in transit, but as a meeting we are quorate, which is great news, so thank you for your attendance. We are due to finish at 8 o'clock. We'll see how we go with the contents. I'm also mindful that there are 316 pages to work through, which I know you've all read and digested. So we'll see how we go. I shall try and manage us through the process in a sensible amount as practical. So with the first item then, we have apologies for absence. Dan?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've had apologies from Councillor Rangzeb and Councillor Sharp is attending a substitute. Councillor Shaz Nawaz and Councillor Iqbal is attending a substitute, and I've just had apologies from Councillor Imtiaz Ali and Dr. Stuart Green, member.
Great, thank you. Item 2 on the agenda is the declarations of interest. So does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? If so, please can they raise their hands now? I see no hands raised, so no declarations of interest. Okay, item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of June 22. So members asked to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of June 22. Can I have a proposer and a seconder for the minutes? Councillor Haseeb to propose.
I propose.
No. I could do with a seconder for the minutes from the last meeting. Councillor Allen, seconder. Thank you. Thank you. One thing just to note in those minutes is that we've now got an action log which sits at the back of the minutes, and we'll keep that log. We'll keep reviewing it, and anything from those actions that trips up after a month will end up going into the work programme to make sure that we get it covered. So when you're reading minutes in the future, just remember where that action log is to make sure that your things are covered. Moving swiftly on then to item 4 of the... Oh, sorry, Mike, question.
Just before we move on, just in terms of the structure of the way we do this, could we take that appendix out and actually make that a formal agenda item for arising and action points? And I think also because the minutes are a full record of everything that went on, it's interesting to note the difference between the way actions are described in the minutes themselves and the way they're described in the appendix subsequently. And I think it would be helpful to have a common between the two, so definition within the minutes of who's accountable for the action, what the due date of the action is, and then the matter, the law becomes in matters arising, which is reviewed on an action basis each and every time. It's a full agenda item, and it's separated from the minutes. And just following on from that, so one of the observations I had was around, we talked about bringing back to this meeting the improvement plan, and the rationale for bringing it back to this meeting was that it was due to be considered by the next council meeting, and it would be sensible for us to be able to review it beforehand. I noticed that that hasn't happened, and it's now scheduled for the September meeting. Just wanted to ask why that had happened. Has it gone to council, and are we therefore reviewing it after council, in which case what's the point? Because ideally the idea of having an audit committee and reviewing things was to review them at a level of detail that the full council wouldn't necessarily get into, and I think it would have been helpful to be able to do that if all that kind of document went to council.
Okay, so 2 things in that question, I think. So the first one around the action point, making it a separate agenda item. That's a very pragmatic and sensible suggestion. Are members comfortable to have that as a separate item to track through the way that's been described? I'm seeing nodding heads, so I think that's great. Let's take that. And then the second is the improvement plan. I'd ask Cecilia, who's not sitting there, so anybody else who is in the room who knows why we don't have the improvement plan just yet.
I think Cecilia is on her way, but I'm not sure
by the delay.
Okay, so that,
Chair, if I can, it did go to our full council improvement plan. Well, it's on the agenda for this meeting, but it did go to full council, and then it's going back to cabinet procedure that's followed. So it really should have come to this committee. Maybe, I don't know, because the agenda's fully packed, but it should have been on tonight's agenda. If we can arrange for it to be circulated in the meantime, and then any comment, would that do?
great. Otherwise 316 pages would have been nearly 400 pages, which would have been so yeah, we'll have to find a way of getting things into the meeting in a timely fashion. Okay. No more questions, then on to item 4, insurance annual report. This is the Chief Internal Auditor, Steve, the first of many items on the agenda. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Before I start, obviously you've mentioned there's a number of items on the agenda all for governance, and they're structured in that way because they feed through into the which is the draft annual governance statement. So in front of you is insurance annual report. It sets out the work that's been undertaken during the last 12 months. It shows you the level of claims which have happened during that period, and also trends from previous years. We have an external cover through our insurance with Zurich Municipal at present, and that is one thing we're actually going out to re-tender this year. So we're starting to put together specification for that, and that should be probably ready about January when we're making an announcement who's got that. We do have a separate insurance fund as well, which is managed internally, and that's where people make bids and we can try and improve things and reduce expenditure as a result of that, as a result of not having to make claims. So what's in front of you is all the trends, etc., and what's happened during the year. Some of the key points to attention: the 3-year actuary review was undertaken, and that identified some savings for the council. The claims trends, there's been an increase in flooding during the year and claims for those. There has been a spike in fire claims as well. Vegetation levels of claims have been on the increase, whereas highways are actually sort of quite level, which is probably partly to do with COVID, less people travelling, and that sort of thing. In terms of COVID pandemic assessment, we haven't got the full impact as yet because obviously claims can still come in, so we can't really report on that. But we've given a flavour of some of the things we do. And the full details are all in Appendix A. That's out all those details and those trends. I've brought with me my insurance manager, so if there are any specific questions on any of the insurance things which have happened, I'm sure Sue will be the... If I can't answer it, I'm sure Sue will definitely be able to. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we'll open the floor to any questions on the insurance report, and great that Sue could attend to answer the difficult questions. Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I suppose people would expect me to ask this question. There's a section in the report about claims claims against the council for subsidence involving trees, and I'm sure we're all aware of the very high-profile Breton tree that was removed despite the fact that the council report saying there was no definitive proof that it was responsible for the subsidence. So I think it talks about, the council considering action to try and mitigate future tree subsidence claims. But my experience is that that is often just removal of trees in a fairly hit and miss sort of way. So are we actually considering as a course of action contesting the claims and actually going to court and requiring the insurance to actually prove that the trees in question are the cause of the problem?
Okay, Sue.
Yes. Yes is the short answer. I'll give you a longer one. The legal position is that the other side have to prove on the balance of probabilities that the tree is a substantial cause of damage. We have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. So we don't ever settle a claim or remove a tree if there isn't sufficient evidence to get over that evidential barrier. So don't take out trees unless there is sufficient proof. The issue we've had is really one of funding. Any tree can be saved, but it's at what cost to the council? And that was the issue with the Breton oak. It would have cost such a lot of money to keep. Obviously, that wasn't a decision for me, but yes, we are looking to completely overhaul the procedure to create circumstances where, if there's a will and we can keep specimen trees.
So, just on that subject, can you tell me how many cases there have been in the last 12 months where the council, in a tree subsidence claim, the council's actually gone to court to contest the claim of an insurance?
We have many that have gone to court, but we've had several where we've denied liability.
And I won't labour the point, but this is a problem not just in Peterborough, across the country. Councils are so averse to risk that they remove not just trees but hedgerows and a whole range of things. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question and thank you for the answer. It does sound like there is a process, and I presume it's expert opinion that's taken into account in this is rather okay council judgment.
Oh yes, we appoint an independent structural engineer to review all the evidence before we reach that decision, and there's also input from the tree team from the arboricultural side as well.
Great. Okay. Any more questions around the insurance report? Mike?
Sorry to labour this a little bit, but I think we've talked about Steve's independence, and I think this is another classic element where I would question whether this is the right reporting line to have the insurance reporting into Steve. He has already given us assurances that the risk management element would be transferred to another responsibility. I think there's a little bit where I would have kind of expected insurance to follow the same path, and just wonder whether this was something that was being planned, or whether this was something we need to ask for as well.
So in the absence of Cecilia,
I've had no discussions on that from your side. No, obviously there has been the discussions about risk management and moving that across, but no, nothing about insurance.
So there's a little bit where I would have seen the logical place for insurance oversight remaining would be with the risk management activity rather than with the internal audit activity. And I would just like to ask Steve to enter into those conversations with the management team and consider whether this was the right reporting line, particularly when we're getting observations here where this is around control over money, finances, and savings for the council. That's not necessarily where I would expect to see internal audit operating.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That question of independence has been before, so we'll get an answer from Cecilia as part of the process. Any further questions on insurance? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the flooding property claims, there's a comment that it been successfully from a public liability, but there's a value quoted. Are they settled? In which case those are a great cost, or is there a risk that they can increase going forward given reconstruct costs and so forth? And I guess the same question goes for those relating to the fires.
They're not settled yet because they're very large value claims, so I've had to go out to tender for the works. They are the top line estimates. The cost shouldn't increase. And there are two separate elements there. There was the public liability claims, which are claims against the council because their cars got flooded in a car park, things. We've defended all those. The ones that we're settling are our own property, and that's going through our property insurance, so there are limited costs to the council just up to our deductible, and the rest has been covered by our insurance.
Okay, thank you. So if there are no more questions, then in terms of this, can we receive, consider and endorse the attached annual report on the provision of insurance service during 2022, subject to the questions and comments that have been made? I'm taking it that we can, as there's no objections. Great, then we can move on to item 5. Again, this is the investigations annual report. Fraud. Over to Steve to present it.
Thank you once again. This sets out the work which has been done by the investigations team during the year. Some of the activities which have been undertaken during the year, we've updated a number of policies across the council. That will continue. We'll be looking at the own policy, anti-fraud strategies, which are going to be worked on this year. NFI is probably one of the biggest activities we undertake in terms of looking at fraud, and there's a large report on that about that going forward and that later on in the agenda. We did bring a report here in February which set out all the findings from that and where it identified fraud and irregularity changes and the notional values which were established for those. Council tax single person discount, again that's something which is on an annual basis, and we download the data, that's sent off to the Cabinet Office, and we plough through those to identify people who have not changed their circumstances. When you think about it, there are over 26,000 people who can claim single person discount, which when you're talking £300 as a minimum, if all of those are fraudulent, that's a lot of money the council's losing out on. I'm not saying they're all fraudulent, one of those is mine. So we get all that data through, and we go through that in fine detail, compared with the records, council tax, with the single person discount, other records we have on electoral roll, identifies a number of cases which we investigate and look to get those savings and reinstate people's full council tax. During the year we had business grants which came on board. These are all the ones which were paid out by the government to us to pay to the various organisations and the businesses for COVID. As a result of those, sent off to the National Fraud Initiative, we did do a lot of checks to making any payments. So the results we got back were really high level and really accurate, showing but there was about 3 or 4 cases which we had to investigate, and we're still going through those. So compared with over 1,200 cases we actually paid out, to have 3 or 4, I think is good, and it shows our processes work very well up front. We also have tax support on there, which this links in where council tax support is given to individuals, and they don't, again, that's something where they don't declare their change in circumstances. We do joint working with the DWP. That has been really on hold during COVID. DWP resources were working elsewhere. They were doing other activities across the government, so that wasn't going on. That has now come back online, so we're now moving those forward to investigate those joint claims. Because obviously housing benefits, we'll have the council tax, they could be joint claims, and it's pointless us doing an interview and them doing an interview. It's all done at once. And finally, areas which are part of the team, they have the stage 2 complaints. These are where sort of individuals across the whole of Peterborough have a gripe with a service that's been delivered to them, and that is it as an issue. It is then responded to by heads of service. If they're still happy with that, that gets escalated into the investigations team to look at. That is something which is an increase. We had 26 last year, there was 18 the previous year. And finally, the other work which the team does is disciplinary grievances, which is obviously involving staff. So obviously I haven't put any details of those in there, but obviously those cases all come through from human resources. And I said that kind of thing, but there is also blue badge misuse as well. People have those blue badges, and for whatever reason somebody passes away and the partner still uses it, or somebody obtains it in error, or somebody even gets it but borrows it from somebody and doesn't return it, it's declared as lost. Somebody else uses it. So we get those provided through to us, and those are investigated. So I'll take any questions on the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. One observation from me in the report, where the report's attached to the appendix, but there aren't actually any tables of stats. It's very much a wordy report, so my suggestion, certainly for the future, is to actually bring some in so that we can actually see those trends, and preferably over a number of years as well. So the commentary talks about things declining or increasing, but actually let's bring the sort of the facts and the evidence into the paper as well. It makes it a bit easier for people to understand it. But a question, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, it's about the corporate complaints. I saw recently that apparently councillors are not allowed to submit complaints, because I had a case where I submitted where a constituent of mine had a problem, and I submitted a complaint on behalf of them, but rather than replying to me, who was the author of the complaint, the service department, which was actually MPS in this case, replied to the member of the public. And so the reason it went to this is if I'd have got the reply, I would have escalated it to a stage 2 complaint, but because the member of the public wasn't aware of the council complaints procedure, they didn't actually do that. So can I have some clarification on that, please?
I just wondered if you want to answer that, Fiona, about councillor complaints.
Well, I think there's a distinction between complaints from a councillor and complaints about a councillor. The corporate complaint system doesn't deal with complaints about a councillor, that comes to me. But I think there may have been confusion there if you were told that, because as far as I know, there's no reason why the complaint system can't deal with complaints from a councillor on behalf of a constituent, so that's very strange.
I was told by the head of property that was the reason why I had gone to the member of the public rather than coming to me, but I don't know. So.
That's odd, yeah, because obviously, you know, nothing came through to us as a stage 2, so it's, you know, if it's been like, you know, we apologise for that if it's gone that way by NPS.
I'd certainly, Councillor Sandra, could go back to them and copy me into the email, and I can have a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so a very specific question, but a follow-up has been promised on that particular inquiry. Other questions regarding the fraud annual report? Okay, so subject to the some actual tables of stats and trends, some actual evidence, and then I'd like to move to the recommendation on page 25 to receive, consider and endorse the attached annual report on the investigation of fraud during 21-22. Members, we agree to these recommendations. Can you let me know of your agreement? I can see some nods, so no disagreement. Thank you. So, item 6, internal audit, the annual audit opinion. So back to you, Steve.
Thank you. So the report on page 35 to 80 sets out our overarching report into activity for last year. It sets out all the bits we've actually covered, our resource is available, and our views on the systems we've actually looked at. The point I'd like to make, the conclusion is, based on all the work we've actually undertaken during the year, whether it's been grants, systems, etc., we're giving it reasonable assurance that there's appropriate controls in place. And I think that's a key message here, that we've been able to deliver sufficient coverage actually to form that view. And that view then gets reflected into the annual statement, which is later on in the agenda. Obviously, we do identify some systems which are not so good, you know, and again, we refer to those specifically in the annual governance statement, and those are actually in 4.3 in your report. There are various appendices which we've actually included as part of the report, and that shows out how we've actually written our opinion in Appendix A. Page 43 shows how we actually concluded that sufficient coverage had been arrived at, and hence me being able to, the Chief Internal Auditor, to give that reasonable assurance view. 45 gives a detail of the recommendations in terms of analysis, the levels of assurance, whether it's reasonable, limited, no assurance, full assurance. One thing I want to make a comment on related to that table, there's quite a few systems which come up as limited. That is probably, well, that is really down to the fact that when we do our audit plan in the first place, we're looking at the audits of highest risk, the ones which have got concern across the council. If we selected the ones which are lowest risk and looked at those, I would be quite confident to say that the majority of those we're coming out as full assurance and would not add value. So our audit plan is always focused on risk and the highest risk. Page 46 to 51 gives you a flavour of those areas which we've actually covered, and it gives you some sort of the number of audits we've done and descriptions of those to see what we've covered. Page 51 there's a number and onwards there's various tables showing the resources and performance. One of the things which just stands out, more time has been delivered than we expected. That's, there's a number of reasons for that. One, obviously, when we build up the audit plan, we put some time aside for non-audit activities. Potentially put, take out the time for people having annual leave and bank holidays and some time for training. Well, if we didn't give everybody as much training as we thought we would, or if people were off less than we expected, we do put it, so there's more time available for productivity. And similarly, additional hours are being worked at various times on some of the audits because of the uncertain turnover. So that's been some of the reasons that's happened. And 54 onwards, that's the actual meat of the report in terms of the table with all the audits in, all the recommendations in terms of the categories and a description of those, whether those are audits or grants. And finally, on page 64, going back to the point where I mentioned that a number of audits were of limited assurance. In terms of our audit charter, anything which is of limited assurance, we bring the executive summary through to members for your information and comment. That is the end of my presentation. I also have with me Julie Taylor, who's the auditor, who have any questions as well to reflect on.
Thank you, Steve. The report is quite detailed. Just one question for me, just for clarity. On page 46, where you've got the implementation recommendations and you've got the no longer relevant and not implemented, it would be helpful of the 19 that's in there, which are no longer relevant and which are not implemented, just to get the split of those two. Just again, so we can see whether it's the ones that are no longer relevant but not implemented. What's the trend there? Does that make sense? Yep. Okay. So questions. So, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah. Just a point of clarification, really. At the bottom of page 49, and it's referred to in other places as well. It talks about energy management, and that there was some concern about that. What is that actually referring to? Is that the energy management in council premises, or is it something else? It's the final paragraph on page 49. It's referred to, but the term energy management comes up in other places as well. So.
Julie?
It'll be about the energy management of the buildings, so anything that we get charged for from a billing point of view. So NPS are the organisation that sort of oversee that generally. So we've done a number of follow-ups in this area, so obviously we are pursuing it to make sure that any issues that do arise, we are trying to progress it through to a natural conclusion. That's why you'll probably see that it's made reference to a few times, because in year we've followed up some of the recommendations, and any that are outstanding, much like we're saying, not implemented in the table. So we do make a note of those, and then we pursue those further on line to make sure that they're implemented, and if they're not, we'd cascade throughout the business to the relevant directors to sort of look at that it's a key issue that these are not being implemented, especially if they're high risk.
Because on the subject of energy management, my impression is in council, but it's fairly good at San Martin House, but it's pretty appalling here, because I don't know if you've ever been in the town hall in January. It's not a very pleasant place to be. So is some action proposed to improve energy management here in the town.
So the particular purpose of these reviews is purely from a financial point of view about how we make sure that we know that what we're being charged for is appropriate. It's not a strategic review about how we actually sort of manage it in terms of energy efficiency as such. These particular reviews were particularly a financial arrangement about we pay for energy, but how do we ensure we're actually being charged for is correct and they're the right buildings, rather than an energy effectiveness climate action point type review.
Okay, that's a good question, but not in the forum. We need to find the forum for that. Just a general question again on the trend. So I noticed that the table on page 45 of audit assurance and the levels over years, limited assurance, I know these numbers are tiny, 4, 2, and then up to 7. If you're assessing based on risk, you kind of expect them to be roughly the same proportions, and we seem to have a little spike there in 21, 22. I don't know if that's me reading more into the numbers than I should be.
So it may, it's quite possible that we have like a very fluid way of planning our audit plan throughout the year. So you'll have seen that we presented an audit plan in March that was approved, but I can guarantee that why you might see a little bit of a spike.
You would have also had the impact in 2020, that's when COVID. So in terms of our audit coverage, there was a marked reduction and some of our work was focused elsewhere.
Okay, any more questions? Mike?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is just to ask Steve to reflect on the boldness of his overall conclusion here. So he concludes that the council has an adequate and effective systems of control in place to manage the achievements of its objectives. But I see a council that's just recovering from a value for money qualification from its external auditors, that is sitting with its 2021 account not yet signed off, because it's not clear that it has sufficient information in its fixed assets systems to be able to demonstrate that it's been accounting for its fixed assets correctly and appropriately. I see a council that's recovering from nearly coming close to being put into special measures and has a financial improvement plan that we've not seen yet and has not been fully endorsed. Which Steve has spent a lot of time working with, but presents no conclusion on his work. I think there's a little bit for me where I can see how he's drawn conclusions from the audits and the work that he's done. I think there's a piece of me that would like to see our Chief Internal Auditor actually not just give us what I describe as a quantitative opinion, but actually a lot more qualitative thought into the overall conclusion. It's very clear for us that he puts in some very neat, subject to qualifications to that overall statement for the limited assurance ones. What I would like to see, I think, from my Chief Internal Auditor is to have a little bit more qualitative input into that overall conclusion, and in particular to take into account the wider elements that he's fully aware of as Chief Internal Auditor through his participation in things like the improvement plan, and to build that into his overall conclusion, because I think taking that kind of approach would provide a lot more information for councillors and for this committee to be able to conclude on whether we think that the council has enough in place in terms of systems and processes and controls to avoid things like value for money for qualifications in the future, to be able to properly account for our assets. You know, I think that strikes to the heart, and it just leaves me a little bit, you know, it's nice to be able to package things up and give that really positive conclusion based just on the work we've done, but there's a lot more going on in this council that isn't being adequately, I think, reflected on in what I would expect from the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report.
Okay, Steve, a chance to respond?
Thank you for that, the question. Yeah, there's a prescribed format for delivering on this, and which is what we follow. And it is, as you're right, it is based on the work which internal audit do. And I accept there are other things going on in the organisation, and those really should really reflect coming through into the annual governance statement, which is later on the agenda.
I would also like to see that in the Chief Internal Auditor's report, because that is part of this committee's input into, you know, what are the things that we should be reflecting on in that governance statement, and you know, in particular, you know, if you go back and I understand prescribed formats, but prescribed formats allow, you know, for elements of subjectivity in there, and I would also point you back to the auditing standards and the expectation from a Chief Internal Auditor that he provides qualitative input into his annual report as well as quantitative. And I would see qualitative input being all those kind of areas that I've discussed there, and anything else that you know, Steve would see as relevant to bring to this committee.
Okay, I think some very good points. We are talking about the annual government statement later on in the meeting. Cecilia, I noticed that you've joined us. Thank you for that. There is a seat here with a microphone next to it if you want to come and join in. And I don't know whether you had any response to that. While you just sort of drift over, one of the things that we need to become mindful of is that when people read the reports that come from the council, they recognise the council. And I think the points that Mike's raised, lots of people are aware of those things being in existence, so not seeing them recognised in the council's reports and not seeing them recognised in the government statements almost seems like there's an omission almost. Rather than recognise them, put them into context and then conclude. So if we have an improvement plan, if we're coming out of into a stronger financial situation, recognise the past but recognise the direction. It's not a bad thing. Yeah.
Apologies for being late. I've come out of I think those are fair comments. I think we can take that away and look at it. I think something Steve and I have already discussed, and which we have discussed here in the audit committee before, about giving internal audit more scope to do more internal audit work and less peripheral other work, and have the risk assessments done by somebody else. So I think I agree with what you said. I think it needs to be reflected.
Okay, so I think in the minutes we'll note what's been said in this section, but we'll also just carry over those thoughts to the annual government statement. Councillor Iqbal.
I think Mike has raised very relevant points. Can I ask why they're not before us today?
Yeah, I think that's Cecilia. Did you want to take that question, or Steve?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question actually. Sorry.
The points Mike has raised. Obviously, we want to have a comprehensive report. Looking at it from a layperson's point of view, you know, it needs to be simple, straightforward, and we can understand it. I mean, from training, what we've learned is that if a report is not right, it's not an accurate reflection, we ask them to submit another report because we have to make a decision on it. Mike has raised very relevant points. I just want to ask officers, why wasn't that part of the report? Why? I mean, obviously they had a discussion about it, but what was the reason for not being part of the report?
As I said, we follow prescribed format of our works. So we've taken all the audit activity the team has performed, and that forms our conclusion. I accept that, you know, that it's just a small part, and the council is a lot bigger. It's just trying, you know, you bringing that all together. That's almost like something for an actual annual report of the council as opposed to an annual report of an audit team, in my view. That's just my only opinion, but we can certainly reflect on that and make reference to other things, and probably and signpost people to other reports which have been produced, as you mentioned earlier in one of the articles about the improvement panel. Yeah, we can signpost those.
Yeah, so I think the points were made in previous audit committee meetings. We have discussed some of those topics. The annual governance statement is the right place as that gets produced to pull those things together and conclude on them, so that the layman can sort of, if you like, reflect and understand the journey that the council's been on. So it might be a paragraph or two in that document that then pulls that together. But we're about to discuss that, so that may be an action from that.
And I think to come into in Steve's support, we work in traditional ways, and we have a very new outlook with the audit committee now. So we will change over time. We will take on board what's been said, and we'll change over time.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? No? Okay. So with regard to the internal audit report annual audit opinion, we are there to receive, consider, provide, challenge, which I think we've done, and to endorse the attached Chief Internal Auditor's annual report for the year ended 31st of March 22, and I'll say subject to the conversation that we've just had, and it'll be in the minutes. So members, can we agree to these recommendations? Yeah. I see nods. Thank you. Item 7. The National Fraud Initiative Strategy. Steve.
Obviously, the last report, an investigation set about National Fraud Initiative. This is the 2-year cycle. We're coming up for October when the next one kicks off. It sets out the strategy, all the various data sets we have to collect the information on, submit into Cabinet Office. It's something all councils have to do. We cannot get out of it. This is where we get that 2-year download, send it off to them, and we get the various data matches and to analyse those if it's a fraud or error. The approach we're looking at is, we've set out there, it's always been driven by audit. We're looking to get the business more involved going forward. Take ownership of your data, and that's what we're trying to do by setting out in that policy. And there's responsibilities across the rest of the organisation, certainly like audit committee, and the responsibilities there to you to oversee it, with fraud and error. So it's just a brief paper setting out a strategy which we're going to be adopting this time to follow. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, so any questions? This is a £4,000 cost. It's some data matching which might throw up some issues that we can then investigate for fraud. So in many ways it's a fairly routine item. Am I reading that correctly?
I'm going to say, yeah, it's just under £4,000 is the cost to actually. We have to download the data, submit it. They charge us £4,000 to do the analysis. On top of that, obviously, there's all the additional time to do the investigations. That obviously is a lot more than £4,000, and that's not reflected in there because that can vary from year to year, because it could be 80 hours, it could be 250 hours for argument, so the amount of time to investigate them.
So just to follow up on that, you've quoted a couple of numbers there. Is that broadly right? Is it effectively?
No, those are just examples. Those are not the actual figures. I haven't looked onto our time recording system to say the exact amount of time, because this, as I said, this is something that goes on over a 2-year period. So it bringing a lot of stuff together. And obviously, if we do send that stuff out to departments and they're doing some time on it, we haven't captured that.
Okay. Any questions on the work on the National Fraud Initiative? Okay. Therefore, I'd like to move the recommendation on page 81, which is to note the mandatory data matching exercise plan for 22-23 and the implications on resources. Members, can we agree to this? Yeah, I don't see any dissent. Thank you. Item number 8 is the risk management framework. And again, this is over to Steve.
Thank you. I'm fully aware that the risk is one, the key driver for this committee. The risk management framework was last updated a number of years ago. Our approach has changed. We're using new software. So the policy has been updated to reflect on those new ways of recording and working. And it sets out the roles and responsibilities, again, as I said, for officers and members. Those clear responsibilities, certainly within the audit committee, and on the next agenda, the next audit committee will be bringing those strategic risks for your information. It's this policy, if it's approved today, will be cascading it through the organisation, so everybody's aware of it. We'll be doing various presentations to bring everybody up to speed, so it's being followed. Happy to take any questions of the approach which is being proposed.
Thank you, Steve. I've got one question which has arisen, I think, from the training session we had earlier on in the week. But any other questions before that one? So my question is, where can members recognise where they get involved in the risk management process? So as I read the policy, it's all very logical and seems very sensible. But if I was a member looking in, I'd be thinking, well, where do I get an input both to the original list and then to the update and the continual progression of that list? Have I missed a section in any of it?
In terms of member involvement, it sets out on page 98, the roles and responsibilities. I think it's quite evident from that one. Cabinet, they're making strategic decisions. So all the reports which are going to Cabinet, it's setting out what they're going to be doing. There are various sections in there to set out what those risks should be. So Cabinet members will get the opportunity to look at those risks. All committee reports, there's sections in there about risks, and that should be setting out there. Now, how those are captured within the risk management system, those I would say are probably not captured as fully as they could be at the present moment in time. Audit committee, obviously you're seeing the strategic risks. Scrutiny committee, similarly, will be able to see those various risks where decisions are being made. So there are various opportunities. I think you're right. I think there's still an opportunity for that to be developed further.
Yeah, thank you. I think my kind of concern is to make it easy. And as you say, I think there's a lot of information and it's in different places. But if I was Councillor Allen, who's just about to ask a question and wanted to know about some things, where does she go? There doesn't feel like there's a single place, but Councillor Allen.
I think a couple of things. When I read through this, it seems that once risk has, we wouldn't be notified until risk has been identified as there is a risk, and I think we're not involved, or people don't know at the point that it's being evaluated that there is an issue. So I think it's too late. And as part of training that I received last week, one of the ideas, we would have a dashboard of risk, and it's continually, assessed, because there's good reason for that to be on the dashboard. So
I'll just add to that. I probably just jumped in ahead of you, Cecilia, apologies. We just had the risk management board this afternoon, and that's one of the things we were talking about, is getting a dashboard and get those in place so we can use those, not just for the risk management board, then obviously that can be provided to portfolio holders, etc., and obviously then develop further for all councillors.
Okay, Cecilia, were you right to read his mind?
Yes, Steve beat me to it. That's exactly what we discussed at the Risk Management Board earlier today, to give members a dashboard in the body of the report and then with appendices so you can delve into the detail. I think that's a really good point, and that's what we're working towards.
Right, okay. I'm mindful of this being a policy. I don't know if the policy can have that amendment in or recognition of that dashboard. If it's sort of on the way, then it would be great to encapsulate it into this.
I'll get that referenced in there. Yeah. No.
Great. Councillor Coles.
Yes, thank you. And this is something that we've been discussing for some time. Cecilia and I we had a very good presentation at SIPFA at the national conference, and we're taking a lot of those tips on board. But you're quite right. I mean, now I find I'm the cabinet member responsible for risk. I'm going to make absolutely sure that people can get to see it.
Thank you. Mike, you're looking.
I think there's some bits for me where I see this as quite a what would I describe it? Quite a limited framework in its articulation of how we look at risk, and I feel that there's room to take a hard look at this framework again. If I were looking at this, I'd want to question even the definition we've got in here of risk. I'd want to see a lot more in the framework about how risks are overseen within the organisation, and in particular the interconnections between oversight within the council and oversight at a broader level, incorporating the members as well. A better articulation of how council members as a whole oversee risk in its totality, because at the moment it seems Cabinet does everything and nobody else gets a look in on anything. I think there's room to have a good look at the categorisations of risks we've got in here. I think there's room to start looking at incorporating the concept of gross and net risk into this. So there's no articulation of how does that quantification process work, and is it gross risk we're talking about, i.e. the total exposure of the council without the controls, and then separately looking at what's the impact of controls on those risks, and therefore what residual or net risk have we got left afterwards. So I think there's a lot of areas where this is a very early stage risk management framework for the council, and I think there's room to challenge its development, and I'd like to see whoever's taking responsibility for ownership of the risk management framework going forward having a really hard look at that, and I'd be quite happy to provide some thoughts and ideas on where that is when we come to look at it, because I think this is an area where we need to do quite a lot of work.
Okay, so there is a free offer from Mike to improve the quality, content and depth of the future risk management policy, which I think will be very good. As you've rightly pointed out, this is an evolution as well. So the more that it can be improved, and I guess we need to pace that improvement because we can't get everything all at once. But some good observations there.
I think that would be really good. And the reference Councillor Coles made earlier to some of the approaches we saw at the SIPFA conference, which we discussed at the Risk Management Board today, is and again, to be fair to Steve, Steve is sitting in finance, in internal audit, trying to have oversight of all the risks within the council, and I think, hand on heart, that's impossible. The kind of approach that we saw used as a best practice model was a risk management board that's more focused than what we have. It is, I'm looking at Fiona now, it's chaired by the monitoring officer probably, and it's a governance issue rather than being a financial and internal audit issue. And I think if we have risk management, is as you're alluding to, is a profession on its own, isn't it? It's not necessarily something you learn as an internal auditor when you train to become an accountant. I think we need a different approach, and I would be really grateful for any support we can have with that and any ideas in setting that up. But going forward, and we've already discussed it, but with everything else going on, we haven't progressed that far until we get the right people in post. But I take on board everything you're saying, and the suggestions you're making is exactly the kind of things that Steve and I have already discussed.
I recognise, as Chris has said, this is an evolutionary process, and this is very much a challenge to step up the pace on evolution. I've been exactly where Steve sits, as head of internal audit, bringing risk management into organisation, and then and the next evolution is then to step back as head of internal audit and pass that on to someone who then takes it to the next level and the next stage in the development. And I think in terms of the challenges to Steve on his independence and to Cecilia to move it out of internal audit is really just a challenge to take the next steps on the evolution of this whole process.
So, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, of the points that Mike was making, the one that particularly chimed with me was the concept of involving more people than just the people in the cabinet in terms of looking at the risk strategy of the council, because we're constantly being told by the Section 151 officer and other people that all councillors have some degree of responsibility for the finances of the council. Yet, I look at page 100 and it says that when it talks about the appetite, the risk appetite, it says that the cabinet has determined that the risk that a risk score of 15 is appropriate. Now, maybe this is because I've not been on audit committee recently, but I wasn't aware of what that actually is. I wasn't aware that the cabinet had made that decision. So I'm not sure what the mechanism is for achieving what you're advocating, but I certainly think that's a good idea.
Thank you. I think the transparency, which is what you're seeking, will come through the recommendations that we've already talked about. And risk management is a bit of a dark science sometimes, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be quite transparent, so it's obvious why things have been risk graded as they have been. Any more questions? Councillor Iqbal?
I think Mike and Councillor Sanford have covered most of the points, but I was just reading the definition, and it's quite scary, isn't it? If I read it out, it says, risk is the chance or possibility of loss, damage, injury, or failure to achieve an objective caused by an unwanted or uncertain action or event. So based on that, I think the framework needs to be more wider. And on top of that, I think what Councillor Sanford said, many times when we had a debate in the chamber, obviously administration are responsible for the budget. And then they say it's your budget, our budget. But if you don't have access, and we don't have the sort of opportunity to look at the risks involved, if that's not transparent or open, so how can we be part of it? So I think openness and transparency is very important. And what Michael said, I think, he's raised very valid points, and you've taken them on board. I think, yeah, that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And I think where that often gets articulated is the range of outcomes if a risk comes true. And again, as part of the evolution, part of the development, then the financial impact of something starts to get quantified, and ranges start to get put on things so that you get some sense of, does it actually matter or not? But that's financial. There are obviously the political, economic, environmental risks as well. And that's the other bit of that dark science. Councillor Coles.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just sort of looking at Councillor Iqbal's particular comment about understanding the risks. Of course, what we haven't been very good at is to educate every member of the council that there is a very clear risk. If you don't set a lawful budget, then you commit an illegal act and you can be held personally, criminally responsible. I think we've probably not been convincing enough that that's the case, perhaps. And I think you're absolutely right. Where these really serious risks exist, we have to be very clear about them and make sure that they're clearly articulated. So I completely agree with him there that we put ourselves in a very difficult situation where we believe we're doing the right thing by looking at things and challenging them, but there are some times when the risk is really very serious and we have to do the right thing at the end of the day. So that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think all points well made, and will all form part of the minutes, and we've got some actions there for the evolution of the policy as well. Any more questions or comments on the risk management framework? Okay, so subject to our conversation, I'd like to move to the recommendations on page 89. These are to note and approve the Council's risk management policy. So I think subject to the discussion that we've just had, we're comfortable. Yeah, actually nods. Thank you. Item 9, Audit Committee Effectiveness. So I think this is where we mark our own homework, Steve.
Well, yes, that you could describe it as that, although it's my homework because I'm the one who actually produced it. What I've actually taken is the SIPA guidance, which sets out in that appendix the various issues which should come before Audit Committee. Do you do it? Yes or no? So it is a straightforward tick and check to see if you're actually meeting those criteria. So that's what you have in front of you. It's my assessment based on what has been delivered. Now, I think the issue really is the effectiveness of those, and that's that's not really measured in the guidance as such. It's sort of a yes or no to doing things. It's obviously one of the things which came out in the improvement from the improvement panel and the various reviews. It said the audit committee needs to be more robust. However, everything which the audit committee is doing, it's ticking the boxes. So it goes back to the very similar thing which you said about the internal audit opinion as well, about this. It captures a small element, but there's bigger things out there. So what it actually does, as I said, I've gone through the SIPA guidance, I've benchmarked against what you should be doing, and you are doing it. It is up to you now as members. I'm putting this to you. This is how I see it. It is now really you need to, as members, review it to see if you recognise it as the audit committee as it's operating, or how you see it, how you want to operate it in the future. And obviously, my last observation, we had training in relation to audit committees last week on Monday, and one of the things in there we mentioned, this was brought up, and obviously there's new terms of reference coming out from SIPFA which haven't been published as yet, but this should be working alongside those new terms of reference when those are released. And I think that is what my proposal or my thoughts on what's in this document. This is opinion as I see it at present. It needs to be taken forward in partnership with the new terms of reference. Happy to take any questions on my observations.
So thank you, Steve. I think the points were made. This is basically to say, do we do those activities? Yes or no? Are those activities effective? Is a completely separate question, which this process doesn't cover. So that's something that we need to do. And the second point, in the training, literally a few days ago, we were party to SIPFA's latest guidance on how audit committees can be even more effective with suggestions for improvements to the terms of reference. So we've got a copy of those which we'll work through to see about how much more we adopt. But questions? So Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of observations really, rather than a question. I think, and they're coming from my perspective of having been on audit committee previously and having come onto it again. A couple of points. I think the recommendation that was made, I think it was by SIPFA, to actually have independent members on the audit committee. I think that I get the impression, only having attended a couple of meetings, that has really significantly improved the robustness of the questioning. So you guys are doing a really good job, I think. But just wanted to also raise a point that came up at the training last week, which I think is a problem as regards the effectiveness of the audit committee. That certainly, I can only speak for the Liberal Democrat group, but at the training we seem to be indicating, it probably applies to other groups as well, that audit committee is seen very low down in the pecking order, that, you know, it tends to sometimes be the committee that people get put on because it's the only one that's available. So I think there's almost a PR job that we need to do within the council about the importance of the audit committee. Again, I'm not sure how to achieve that, but I think it's probably needed.
Thank you for those comments, which I endorse. Yeah, you can respond.
I think that's a really good point. And in my experience, that is exactly what happens. You get members on the audit committee who are not necessarily the right members. I am doing my very, very best to change that perception. I think the audit committee is extremely important. And I think when something goes wrong, there certainly will be views about the effectiveness of the audit committee. So from a PR point of view, I am absolutely doing my best to improve the perception about the level of importance of the audit committee. And I think sometimes we get members who, especially with the committee, and it'd be interesting to hear what Neil thinks as well. I have sat through many audit committee meetings, and I think this one is particularly good, hand on heart. I think this is a very good committee. And I think it's very helpful that we have a mix of members with very detailed knowledge of finance and the markets, and also other members who are not so financially minded. I think we need that mix to make it as effective as possible, because it's not all about the numbers and the detail, it's about the bigger picture as well. So it's important to get that balance right.
Just a very brief thing back on that. I think there's perhaps a perception out there amongst councillors that you need to be an accountant to be on the audit committee. Yeah, I think I've certainly found that quite a lot of the things that we talk about aren't accountancy things. So,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You need to have an inquiring mind, and asking why is usually the main thing. I'll just ask Neil to respond to some of the comments that have been made about the effectiveness of the audit committee. Obviously, myself and Mike have only experienced a small number of meetings. I think you've been around a bit longer, so it'd be good to get some of your thoughts.
I think compared to other audit committees that I sit on, I'm seeing clearly an improvement over the last few months. And I think it's clearly been driven by the improvements that this council has needed to take in light of its financial position and the response to it. But clearly you're acting on the recommendations that SIPFA, Sir Tony Redmond and various others are about improving the effectiveness of audit committees, getting a better balance between sort of the executive members, but also independent members joining this committee with relevant skills and experience. And I agree with the comment, it doesn't necessarily have to be accountants that have to sit on this committee that do so. I think it's those individuals that can provide sufficient rigour and challenge, not just on the finances, but governance and risk management as well. And I'm seeing a lot more of that coming through in my attendance at this meeting, and relative to a number of other organisations that I'm the key audit partner for. I can see you've stepped up, whereas I think other councils that may not be in quite the same financial position that you've been in historically could still benefit from having improved effectiveness of their audit committee.
Thank you. Councillor Allen.
Thank you. In response to Nick's comment about it not being seen as important with other members, and Councillor Sharp's just referred to 2.5 in this list, which says, has Audit Committee considered how it integrates with other committees that have responsibility for risk management? I emailed, based on Dan, you sent out an email asking us to integrate with our members and ask questions, because obviously it's coming to full council on Wednesday. And it's relevant, and I think on the back of that interaction, I know our leader had a meeting with Neil and other people. It does stimulate conversation, so we are responsible ourselves for stimulating and trying to gain this committee as being something that's quite special, really.
Yeah, thank you. And I've also challenged the mayor, the leader of the council, chief executive, etc. So I've had those conversations as well. But it is exactly as you've described. We have information in here which you can use to challenge, and if you're not seeing things, if there isn't transparency, then let's raise it, and I'll endorse it all the way to make sure that it happens. Okay. Any more questions before we get on to some... Oh, Mike.
So I think my biggest challenge here to Steve would be the words he used around ticks in the boxes. So I understand that what has been done here is to measure the way that the Audit Committee operates against current SIPFA guidance, but we're all aware that SIPFA guidance has been developing and emerging over a number of years now. You know, I assume you participate within SIPFA and are fully aware of the changes that are impending, and I would very much like to see an effectiveness review step away from being a tick in the box exercise and to actually bring all of your professional knowledge, all of your professional understanding to bear on how, the question of effectiveness of the committee. And therefore, I think, when we're doing an effectiveness review, we shouldn't be just ticking a box. We should actually be thinking about, where are we? Are we good enough? Where are SIPFA standards going? Yes, we can tick it, against the current standards, but we know actually sometime in this later year, when SIPFA's finished its internal process, there will be some much more demanding standards out there that we fall well short of, and we know that. And I think we should be beginning to recognise that now, not when it happens. And following on with the same concept, I was a little bit horrified at the number of elements where the tick in the box was no. And actually, there's no observation about doing anything about it. So, as I look at it, I think, we don't set out a target number of meetings in our terms of reference, and I really think we should do, regardless of whether, that is SIPFA guidance, and we don't do it at the moment. Things like the Audit Committee should meet in private with the Head of Internal Audit and external auditors. I fully believe that should happen at least annually and more frequently as appropriate. I think the Audit Committee Chair should regularly meet in private with the Head of Internal Audit and with the external auditors, none of which is in our terms of reference, and we've ticked the no boxes on them quite happily and not said we're going to do anything about them. I think we need to really step up and step away from ticking the boxes to actually bringing our full professional judgment and experience and knowledge to bear on this kind of assessment and this kind of a process, and to recognise where we are and what we want to do about that. And I think it's really important for everybody around the room that is how we look at these kind of things. And I think in terms of, it was very helpful for the committee itself to have the council officers fill out this questionnaire for us. But I think there's an element where we probably ought to be taking a little bit more accountability for that ourselves as well. And I think, Chris, my challenge would be to you, how do you lead the effectiveness process in future and get us away from box ticking and actually input your thoughts and challenges into how this process evolves, rather than when the ticks in the boxes appear at the meeting at the end of the day.
Yep. All points well made, and can't disagree with any of it. We're definitely on that journey, and we'll just see how fast we can go.
Yeah.
Because what we can't do is run so fast that it all falls apart. So hopefully make some steady but progressive steps. Okay. Thank you. If there are no more questions, then I'd like to move to the recommendations on page 109. Consider the response to the SIPFA Toolkit checklist for audit committees, which records that the committee overall meets the current good practice statements. I'll just add that in there as the current ones. Can we agree to these recommendations subject to the conversation that we've just had about improving things? Okay, again I see nods. Thank you. So we'll move on to something which we've already talked about, but we can go into a bit more detail now. The draft annual governance statement. The first thing I put on when I read this on the very first page was, do we recognise Peterborough in it? So when you read the governance statement, does it reflect where we think we are with governance? It wasn't a question I could answer, but it was a question I want to make sure that when the governance statement finally goes out, it does look and feel like Peterborough. So, is it Cecilia, is it you two? Or is it Steve again to thank you, Steve.
It's my last item, so you'll be glad to hear. You won't hear my voice for too much. What you have in front of you is the draft annual governance statement, which is, as you've already described, it sets out how the council operates, and the document sits in the statement of account, which is later on in the agenda. In terms of putting the information together for the draft annual governance statement, there's a number of sources. Appendix A sets out, an overarching assurance framework where there's all the myriad of sources. Obviously, all those can't be checked every single year, so obviously various items will be selected and built up. But there's key ones which are actually included as part of the papers. The annual audit opinion, which you've already had on the agenda. External audit, which you get throughout the year. We do an internal control and governance self-assessment, which goes out to all directors each year, and that covers all those 15, 18 areas with a series of questions which we get responses back to, and then there's some filtering and checking on the various aspects of those. Risk management, corporate governance. Corporate governance, there is a local code of governance which obviously we're about to look at. That needs to be refreshed and updated, and that's something which audit will pick up as part of an internal audit review. Because it's not an audit document, but we will certainly be looking to challenge that. And obviously financial controls, which is in place across the council. So the document you have in front of me, the draft annual governance statement in Appendix B, I pulled together, and that was submitted to the corporate leadership team, and the corporate leadership team have added a lot of comments, changed things, and updated it. So there is ownership at the top executive. So ownership of this represents how the council is. So that is in Appendix B. But obviously each year there are things which aren't as good as they should be, and previous actions are set out in Appendix C, where things should have been done, and actions were put there, what was meant to be done to deliver it, and the progress that has been made. And obviously, last year as well, new things came about, improvement panels and that sort of thing. So we set out in Appendix D new actions which need to be delivered on. A number of those are ones from previous years which have rolled forward, and this year we've actually rebranded those with new numbers because it was to make it easier to understand, but we do reference those back to previous years. And there are 13 actions in there which are identified to be delivered during the year. So happy to take any questions about its compilation and what's in there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm mindful that there's a lot of detail in here within the report, but let's take questions and see how we go. So Councillor Sandford first.
Yeah, I appreciate that the majority of this is about the process of governance rather than the structures, but I notice on page 157, one of the actions that is being taken forward is with regard to the council structure, but it seems to talk mainly about the senior management team. Under the improvement plan, there is a paragraph in there that commits the council to a review of its corporate governance in respect not just the senior management but also the democratic structures. And this is something that we did discuss briefly at the training, because I'm the chair of the Constitution and sort of Ethics Committee, and we are the body of the council charged with taking that forward. I think Fiona would probably agree with me that there's maybe a difference of opinion within the members of the committee as to how extensive the change in the structures ought to be, but I think it needs to be sort of linked into this process because, if there are deficiencies in the processes, they could be a result of structural issues, and so any changes that are made to the structural issues need to be geared towards improving the processes, if you see what I mean.
Yep. Any reflections on those comments? Because I'm mindful of the improvement plan as well. Cecilia?
So, I'm in danger of repeating myself now, but I think the same as with the risk strategy sitting in internal audit, and again, Steve and I have discussed this, and we discussed it in the resources management team meeting as well, about Steve is putting this all together a little bit in isolation, sending it out to everybody ignoring him, and then it goes to the corporate leadership team, and we suddenly think, oh, better pay a bit more attention to it. So I don't think it's right that the responsibility should sit with Steve to produce the AGS. And again, the feedback we had at the SIPA conference, Councillor Coles, was very much like it should be more corporate buy-in, including with members. And I think this idea we have about having a new risk manager and a governance board that oversees all of this will improve how we pull together the AGS and get that wider buy-in and ownership as well.
One of the questions whenever I look at these particular sorts of things is for completeness. So often they're very detailed, they've got lots of stuff in them, but actually what's missing? So that's often the thing that worries me in when you read these things. So one of my questions to you as members, participants in this committee is there anything that you expected to see in this list that actually hasn't appeared? Now I've got one, so I'll just, while you're thinking, I'll just mention that one. And it was the governance and management of investments or joint ventures. And in particular, the governance and management and creation of running them. So why do we have a joint venture? How is it set up? How is it risk assessed? What's the value for money implications? There's a whole list of questions there. And looking at the way Peterborough is evolving, we're doing more and more of it. So if we've got £18 million going through one of our single wholly owned subsidiaries, on a basis where there's no competition in the contract, in the tendering process, are we happy with that? And what control should be around it? So that was one of my specific questions. I don't necessarily need an answer to that one now, because I think it's more about the process that's been gone through to make sure that everything's included. But just thought I'd just sort of probe the floor a little bit to find out if there's anything that you expect to see that isn't there. So Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, just wanted to come back on the point I was making. I think the specific point is on page 157 in Appendix D, I think it is, where it talks about ongoing actions. It defines council structure as being the senior management team of the council, and certainly in the improvement plan, that envisages us looking at the democratic processes also. So I appreciate there's an issue about who actually carries that out, but I think it needs to be part of this.
Okay, so the
Can I just add to that? On 159, there is a reference to good governance and decision making. So that captures part of your thing about areas for improvement in decision making and the democratic process. So it is it's just been separated, so kept it there.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just having a pause because there's a lot of detail in there, and it is something to think about. In terms of the process for this annual governance statement, I noticed that the paperwork says about us agreeing and approve the statement for signature by the Chief Executive. So can I just check in the process, are we agreeing and approving this statement now, or is this the first draft statement that we get to look at and something will happen later? I don't know who I'm asking that question to, but I don't know the answer. No.
So I don't know, this is the one opportunity you have to look at it, but it gets published as a statement of accounts, which will not be finalised until September, is that right? So does the committee wish to look at it again?
So from my perspective, I'm conscious it's very detailed. I'm conscious that for members to sort of read, digest it and spot what's missing, it feels like having a window of opportunity for contemplation to then come back and say, actually, I'm fine. I've had a look and I'm fine. Feels like the right thing to do. I'm getting some nods from Councillor Allen and Councillor Sharp, do you just want to expand on your nods, just to make sure it's not just me?
Yeah, I think I'd agree, concur with your view that given the level of detail, it'd be good to review it again. Yeah, especially like some of the comments made as well tonight, if that's doable.
Yeah. So what I'll have to do is talk to Dan about the process by which we can make sure that we've asked the question again to get any sort of final comments or any questions around emissions, and then a process for getting those questions answered. I'm conscious it might take some time to do that, but I think as a principle, we've read it in the papers, we've discussed it today, we've got one or two comments, but I think it is that little period for reflection on is there something missing or something that might need to be added would be helpful. And we'll try and keep that relatively short if we can. So.
Can I just double check? We have to get them signed off by the end of July, don't we?
I think you have to you're required to ensure that you've approved the draft statement of accounts, including the governance statement, ready for publication on your website as unaudited at that stage. But that doesn't preclude everything that the chair's just mentioned about obtaining comments from members of this committee, and indeed Steve's just referred to me that clearly from an external audit point of view we'd be reviewing the governance statement as well to make sure that's consistent with our knowledge. And I'd also say the governance statement is a document that should be kept live throughout the process in which the accounts are audited. So up until the point the accounts have been audit has been concluded and authorised for issue, the governance statement can still be an evolving document up until that point. Yeah.
Great, okay, so that seems like a sensible thing to do. Mike, you've got your microphone on. Are you poised to ask a question, or is that a legacy of previously?
It's a legacy, but I think just in terms of observations on this, as you know, just based on our conversations today, I think we need actions in there around risk management framework going forwards. I think we need actions in there around reviewing the operation of the audit committee and alignment with the soon-to-be published new CIFA standards. There's a little bit in there where there's a number of these points which are historic actions which are closed off by reference to the ongoing improvement plan, but I wasn't quite sure how and where the improvement plan and those elements figured in these statements. I think there was an element around debt management where I think we should take another look at how we're closing that one off, because I think actually I'm much more nervous about our debt management, debt position going forwards than anything else. And in particular, you know, the observations we had at the, I think it was a January meeting where we considered the Treasury management statements and challenges to the debt ceilings that we were building into those policies. And yeah, and in the light of moving interest rates, I would like to understand, you know, interest rate sensitivity of this council and the expenditure, you know, going forwards. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we should be thinking about adding to these kinds of governance statements.
Yeah, okay, I recognise all the things you say. I think it was a February meeting that we discussed those things, and the balance here is not answering very specific things. So what is the calculation of the interest rate exposure in the current borrowing arrangements of the council, for example, but what should be reflected in the risk statement to make sure that we do take that risk into account, which I think it is broadly mentioned in the list.
And the list of actions.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Sharp?
Yeah, just following up on some of those, that sort of headline comment that was just made there, but also coming back to the reason I was saying what I was saying earlier. It just strikes me that there's some elements in here where there's some detail that needs further assessment, and that's the reason my comments. I'm going to just bring one example around business rates. We're making a comment that we're going to undertake to ensure that the £11.5 million 2021 deficit is recovered. We've got no visibility at the moment of whether that is recoverable. Businesses could have gone bust and not be paying the council tax. But however, we're making that statement. So there's a lot of detail in here I feel that we should have an opportunity to come back on, but I understand now the timescales have been quoted.
Yeah, so I think for some of those specifics, it's a case of putting them in writing and then channeling them to the people who can provide some answers to it, so that we're not making a bold statement. It might be an intention and a direction rather than something that a reader might take as being very absolute. Okay. Thank you. So, lots of things that we've talked about there with the annual governance statement in terms of independence, in terms of its content and its detail. We've got an action to collect further comments and further questions that we can try and get answered before we get down to any kind of action or approval. So in this meeting, we've got recommendations on page 125, which is about noting the arrangements for compiling, reporting on and signing the draft annual governance statement, and we've talked about a modification to that. Review and comment on the draft annual governance statement. Well, that's what members are encouraged to do over the next couple of weeks. And subject to those things above, then we can agree and approve the statement for signature by the Chief Exec and Leader of the Council. Okay. Fine. So that's a subject too, I think, in my book.
Can I just ask a question on that? So what's the mechanism for that happening? Are we going to submit any comments to yourself, or are you going to be authorised to sign it off, or what?
So I'll have a chat to Dan after this, just to find out what is a sensible process, because I'm mindful that being an independent member, then I'm not sort of within the wheels. So I'm sure there'll be some internal conversations, and then we'll work out what the right process is. If that makes sense. I wouldn't want to make any promises. I'm sitting here. Okay. Thank you. Item 11 then is the verbal update on the audit results from the year ended 31st of March 21. So over to you, Neil.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I don't propose to go through this in a lot of detail, but I went through quite extensively last time, and I know the intention was to bring our audit results report to this meeting. What we are waiting for is a resolution to a national issue from SIPFA on the accounting for infrastructure assets. We have been expecting the outcome of the consultation around a solution to an issue that's not just been faced by Peterborough, but a number of other local authorities around the accounting for subsequent expenditure on infrastructure assets, and then how those assets have been de-recognised appropriately in the financial statement, so that the gross book value and net book value of the infrastructure assets are appropriately stated. Frustratingly, I don't think we have yet a final position on this from SIPFA, though we are expecting a statement from SIPFA shortly. Though from the readout I've had from it coming back fresh from holiday, is that we expect SIPFA may be issuing a statement that provides an elongated timetable to resolve this matter, including through their code of practice. So that does mean that individual audit firms are going to need to take a decision about what to do in consultation with individual or audited bodies to get to a conclusion and issue audit opinions, because we've been waiting, and I think in agreement with the officers, for this position to be resolved such that we could get the audit concluded. I think if the timetable is going to go on for much longer, we would want to get this audit signed off before the end of August, and particularly conscious I'm leaving EY on the 9th of September. I think it's in everyone's interest to see that this audit is signed before I leave, because the consequences of somebody picking this up from me and going through a further review of everything that I've done doesn't seem to make much sense. So we do need to have a robust conversation, I think, with the officers about where do we go if there is a further delay in the timetable from SIPFA. I think just to give one of the options that we may be talking to the officers about would be to provide to issue a qualification to the financial statements on the grounds of a limitation of audit scope, and that would be to say we don't have sufficient information to be able to form a view on whether the accounting for subsequent expenditure on infrastructure assets has been accounted for appropriately because of the level of information and records that exist to go back in time to reach that conclusion. That's one option. Another option is the officers spend a lot of time proving to us that that is possible, such that we can audit it and issue an unqualified opinion. But that will need to move at some pace during August so that we can conclude. So I have agreed with Cecile and through the committee secretariat a date of the 31st of August to receive our audit results report. And I do think, given that we've been waiting for this to be resolved, irrespective of where this gets to, I think you need to get an audit results report in writing from me, setting out the findings from the rest of our audit, and that we conclude the rest of the work we're doing on the consultation on your going concern disclosure, because that looks at your financial position looking out for the next 12 months and the budget and the cash flow forecasts. I think based on where I'm headed at the moment, and I know last time I was giving you a range of options, I think I'm likely to be ending up in what's called an emphasis of matter in our audit report. I won't guarantee that that's going to be where it is, because I need to go through a consultation with our professional practice team, but an emphasis of matter essentially isn't a modification to our audit report, it isn't a qualification. What it does is it draws attention to any reader of the accounts to what's considered to be a fundamental disclosure in the council's accounts, but it would reflect from our perspective the steps that have been taken since last year's audit to improve the council's financial position. The level at which now you're reliant on a capitalisation directive has reduced significantly. There is still remains some significant uncertainty on your budget position looking outward, but we believe that's currently being appropriately disclosed in your accounts. We do need to go through that final checks ourselves and through our professional practice team, but to give you a sense of where I'm headed on going concern, I think that's where I am going to be. If I still think from consultation that there is a material uncertainty, that will relate to the continuity of service provision, and that would probably be at odds with your officer's disclosures, because in the past, in the 1920 accounts, they've been prepared on the basis of a material uncertainty on going concern. In closing 2021, your officers are not proposing material uncertainty on going concern now. They're recognising quite appropriately there are risks and uncertainties, but not to an extent that would call into question the delivery of statutory services over the next 12 months. So if we still end up in a material uncertainty, then obviously that would lead to more of a qualification, I think, on our accounts, or asking for your accounts to be revisited to include more narrative to explain that there is a material uncertainty. So those two pieces of work will be ongoing, and we certainly will be progressing going concern in this period, irrespective of where we now get to with infrastructure assets. The only other area that we're following up is just making sure that we've revisited all the events and conditions around the council's interest in the Empower Community Interest Company and the loan that was the associated loan. There was a default on that loan before the 31st of March 21. I think members are well aware of what's happened since then around the administration of the Empower Community Interest Company, and also then subsequently the assets being brought in-house. What we're just double checking ourselves is were the events that took place just before the 31st of March 21 indicative of the council having more control over the activities of Empower Community Interest Company and then the subsidiary companies, ECSP1, those that were running the solar panel assets, such that that should have been consolidated into the council's accounts under the group accounting. The consequence of that is if you were to say it was a group arrangement, is the valuation of the solar panel assets actually should be on the council's group balance sheet. I have asked the officers for a revised group assessment taking account of all of those events and conditions up to the 31st of March 21 and subsequently. And we will be concluding out on that as to whether or not that is indicative of a group relationship or not. But irrespective, say we conclude there isn't a group relationship, I'm still expecting the final set of accounts to include a disclosure note in as thorough detail as possible to explain what the evaluation of the solar panel assets will be when they are accounted for in the 21-22 accounts, because I think the final set of accounts need to indicate whether there is a further impairment associated with the asset, because there was an impairment down to just over 20 million at the end of March 20. My feelings are there will be a further impairment when there is a valuation of the solar panel assets. Though quite rightly, the officers are saying that the market around solar panel assets remains quite buoyant, so there may well be a better valuation than I'm expecting, but at this point I'm still expecting a further impairment to be recognised, and I think for transparency that needs to be set out in the financial statements for 2021 as a post-balance sheet event before we sign off. It does note in the paper that some of this additional work is coming out of some of our external review that's been undertaken by the FRC into our 1920 audit. I think just to clarify that point, we've certainly agreed with some of the findings from their review today that we would revisit the group assessment on Empower before we sign off 2021. But we still stand by our opinion for 1920 that we didn't believe there was a group relationship that existed at that point in time. So you will get an audit results report from me at your meeting. I don't think it's appropriate to delay that any longer, irrespective of this position on infrastructure assets. Though in the meantime, I will be discussing with the officers of the options to make sure we can issue our opinion on the 2021 accounts before I leave EY.
Thank you for the update. So that's a lot of work to be done in 5 weeks. Just a question with regard to Peterborough versus the rest of the country. So you started off by saying that this isn't just Peterborough, this is nationally. So of the options that you've described, we're likely to see that across the country?
I think EY are a little bit further ahead than the other audit firms at the moment in considering our options, because I think we're conscious of the hold-up on 2021 accounts across the country, but we're anticipating if there isn't a resolution to this soon, there will be a number of qualified opinions based on limitation of audit scope, unless the auditors have been able to get sufficient and appropriate evidence that these records do exist to be able to identify the subsequent expenditure on each individual infrastructure asset and be able to satisfy themselves that the appropriate derecognition of that valuation has taken place. But some of that is going back in time. It's not just looking at the position for 2021. We're working back to the introduction of IFRS in 2010.
Okay, thank you. So Peterborough won't be the only
no.
the only county council subject to it, but we're at the forefront of trying to get an opinion out.
Yes, I think in terms of what EY are seeking to do ourselves, we've certainly been looking at all of the options. Our view in EY was always to wait to see what the SIPFA position was going to be, but we're getting to a stage where we can't really wait much longer, but we understand a statement's imminent, and if that statement does indicate the timetable is going to be moved out, I think we seriously have to then consider what modifications would we make to the audit reports to get some audit opinions issued, and we can move on to 21-22.
Okay, questions? So Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, so there was a lot of content in that, and you were talking really quickly. So I just wanted some clarification, because I appreciate you said that you've not reached any final conclusions, but could you just summarise in a couple of sentences what you were saying about the issue of whether the council's a going concern? Because I believe you said the area of doubt that remains is about service continuity. So is that, you know, whether the council's financial position could lead to some important services that the council provides being in jeopardy then? Or?
I think that's well summarised, actually, because the asset test for public sector accounts is based on all of our work on our stress testing of the council's budget and cash flow forecast for the next 12 months. Are there any material uncertainties that cast doubt on the council being able to continue to provide its current statutory services at the same level in 12 months' time? That's a different test to whether an organisation will exist, which is what you see in the corporate sector, where there is a lot more importance placed on going concern, because these organisations may actually dissolve or because they don't have sufficient cash or ability to deliver their budget. I think for local authorities this is more about the provision of statutory services for the next 12 months. So sorry, apologies, I was talking fast, but you've certainly interpreted what I said very well.
Thank you. Any more questions? I do feel sorry for the officers in this particular situation, because at the end of the day we're sort of victims to somebody else's judgment and how it gets resolved. So we can only do our best, and it's over August, which is the worst time of the year. Okay. And I guess it's, sorry, okay, it's just the poise of the pen. I think it would be useful just to get an update as we get into well, for the September meeting, just to see how this has all progressed and mapped out, which I'm sure will be there anyway, even if it's just verbal, and even though you may well be moving on to bigger and better things. So if this is your last attendance here, thank you very much for everything that you've done in it, or do we get you back one more time?
And as I say, I'm talking to Janet Dawson, who I report to regularly about my portfolio, and it's, as I say, this audit is one I do desperately want to sign off before I go. If it's unlikely to happen, I need to be clear with you and the officers about what that means, but typically it would just mean whoever's taken this audit on from me will need to re-review what I've done and reach a final conclusion on behalf of EY and issue the audit report. That's a process I don't think any of us really want, given where we are and given how advanced the audit is. So all the more reason why I want to just have those frank conversations if we have to about what our options are in reporting. But a qualified opinion doesn't come lightly, and therefore if the officers want to look at other options to avoid that, we will clearly look into that and see what's possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. If there are no more questions, then the recommendation is on page 161 to receive and to note the verbal update that we've just received, which I think we all do. I see some nods, I don't see any dissent. So that's fine, and we'll look forward to seeing how on earth that is resolved. Right. Draft Statement of Accounts, item 12. Conscious of time, hopefully everybody's still okay and nobody has to run off immediately at 8. But we'll try and get through this. I'm very conscious that this is a very large document. I've got a few questions from my reading of it. I'm taking that this is a draft document because I've noticed that on some of the pages the numbers are actually not correct. And then I think that some of the numbers should be blank. I've raised this with Kirsty just before this meeting. And so I think in terms of a document, some of the numbers in the group accounts pages shouldn't be there because I think they're a carryover from previous times. Yeah, I think before I run through my points, because they're my specific questions, but any questions from the meeting with regard to the draft annual statement of accounts. And again, the job here is not to sort of make sure they add up and cross-cast and all the spelling's correct, though that's something that I just do because I can't help it. But it's more to see in general, do these look like the way that Peterborough performed in 21-22? Does it have the sort of disclosures that you expect to see? Page 270, for example, a tech-oil company. Are people happy that they know what that is, what it does, and what risks it brings? Those sorts of things. But any questions from members? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You perhaps say this is a slightly minor point, but on page 173, it's got a graph that shows the political composition of the council. That needs updating because there's been a change recently. So.
No, thanks for the observation. That's one for Kirsty to check. I can see that she's noting it down straight away. Any more questions? Okay, I mean, one of my observations, which, again, whether this is a fair observation or not, page 199 of the pack has the remuneration tables in, and we seem to have significantly more people paid at higher rates than we had in the previous year. Usually that's an area where the public love to go to have a look at and see why. So I think the numbers, I think we had 2 people paid more than 135,000 last year. We've got 10 people this year. Seems like a big increase. Usually there's some sort of comment so that the public understand why that sort of thing occurs. I've got some comments on one of the references on page 207 is incorrect. The tech-oil company on page 270 I think is interesting. We do have the September Audit Committee where we're going to be looking at procurement and single tender contracts. The nature of a tech-oil company, which Peterborough has, where £18 million goes to, means that they don't have to put that out for competition. So the work goes straight to the tech company. You don't have to tender for it. It just gets awarded. Is that good value for money or not? Might be a question that people might ask. It's a little bit buried in the accounts because it's back there in the notes and when you read the turnover number and the description, etc. So they're the sort of questions that as a reader who doesn't know a lot of the detail of how Peterborough works, I look at that kind of thing and think, oh, that's kind of interesting. So when it comes to these kind of reviews from an audit committee on the accounts, it's whether the disclosure is good enough, whether it's rich enough, whether it's really saying, answering the questions that you think your readers might answer. Okay. I'm mindful that we haven't got many questions, and I realise that we've also been sitting here for 2 hours as well at the end of a working day. Mike, you've got a question.
I think my key observation here is just around this whole process of account and audit and actually delivering on our expectations here and how this ties back into our early debate around the governance statement. So, as I recall, Principle G in the governance statement, it was all about openness, transparency and audit and all the rest of it. And yet what we've got here is a clear situation where we failed to meet our obligations to have our accounts audited and delivered by November of last year. We're clearly going to fail on that same principle, same objective this year because the audit isn't even going to start until January 2023. So it isn't going to start until 2 months after we're supposed to get these audited and finalised. And yet there's nothing in our governance statement about that situation. There's nothing in the action plan about how on earth are we going to get ourselves back on track in terms of actually meeting our obligations with regards to getting these accounts audited and delivered. And I think there's a big missing in the governance statement around this whole situation with our accounts and our inability to get them audited and signed off within the prescribed timescales.
Yep, it's factually correct. Some strong statements. We've talked about the annual governance statement earlier on in the meeting and how we can try and improve it and make it reflect the position that Peterborough is in. And I think the points that you've raised there do need to be part of that. We have a deadline for the end of this month to get this document live, I think, to the public. So this particular agenda item, accepting everything you've said, is any comments or questions on the document that's going to be published in 5-6 days' time. So I just wanted to make that clear, but I don't disagree at all with any of the comments that you made, Mike. Good observations. Councillor Sanford?
Yeah, I think Mike's made a good point, actually, because I'd just like to add to that, because I think there's also an issue of public perception. I seem to remember when in all the debates about Europe were going on, people in the anti-European side were constantly raising the issue of the EU's accounts hadn't been signed off. And the implication there is that, because the accounts haven't been signed off, there's something funny going on, that there's something corrupt about the organisation. And I'm not saying that's the case with Peterborough Council, but I think there's a danger that if we don't get the accounts back in the correct process, that people out there who don't know much about the council will start, drawing on unfortunate conclusions. So.
Cecilia, I don't know if you want to respond to that. It's all factually correct.
Yeah, I don't know what to say really. I think it's a difficult position, and I'm a little bit horrified as well about the possibility of a qualified opinion as well. I think we need to take that away and think about it.
An observation on the point that Mike's just made. Actually, I think that's a very good point, but I'll probably just turn it around into what are things within Peterborough's control and making it very clear and transparent about what Peterborough have done to prepare a set of accounts ready for audit. What are Peterborough doing to challenge the timetable for external audit? And what is the current position of the audit firm delivering the audit, on its ability to provide it within the timetable, and the national issues. So I completely agree it needs to be more transparent, but actually, and factually it's correct, but I would take the view, and this is probably knocking EY and generally the system within local public audit at the moment, that it's not of Peterborough's doing about where things are at the moment. Actually, it's good that you've got a draft set of accounts ready for this committee to consider, and I think that's good and within the timetable. So I think it does need to be more transparent to anybody that is examining your accounts. And previously, when there's been delays, I've been supporting organisations to get appropriate statements onto your website to explain why there is a delay to the audit of the accounts and the reasons for that, and I'm sure I'd be happy to do that again for 21-22. So as I say, I don't think taking it in the round, the reason why we are where we are is something that can be wholly attributable to your systems of internal financial control, or the way in which you've been able to hit your own timetables for producing draft accounts. So I think it just needs to be appropriate balanced statement, though I agree with the point that it needs to be front and centre. Yeah.
And I think it's good to hear you saying that, Neil, and I sort of take on board what Councillor Sanford has said as well. We here in the Audit Committee know, and it's very good to have you here saying that firsthand, because there's always a perception, and perception can be quite different to reality. And I think we definitely need to put something on our website to explain it to people who aren't as close to it as Audit Committee members are. It's very unfortunate.
Okay, so I think we all recognise that the position that we're in, we are more victims of this situation, but we are taking all the steps that we can to get the best result possible from it. Again, conscious of time, we've had a discussion about the draft statement of accounts. This document, the draft, will go live in 7 days. There are some pages that need to be modified because they've got the wrong numbers in, etc. The annual governance statement doesn't go with this document live in 7 days, so we've got a bit longer to work on that to get the transparency that we've talked about. But subject to those changes, the recommendations on page 183 for members to review and comment on the draft statements. Well, we've been doing that. And for members to note, the annual governance statement will be a separate report in 21-22 and not included in the draft statement of accounts, which is what we've just discussed. So members, can we agree on those comments? Okay, I'm seeing some nods and no nods of dissent. Okay, we are getting down to the final few minutes. So use of our IPA is item 13. There are no updates on this. Item 14, debt write-offs. There are no updates on this. Item 15, decisions of the Shareholder Cabinet Committee. This item is here to note the decisions of the Shareholder Cabinet Committee and whether members have any comments or questions on them. Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, just a point for Fiona really. In paragraph 6.1, it talks about an amendment to the trustees of the Mayor of Peterborough's Charity Fund. I think I'm a trustee of the Mayor's Charity Fund, so do I need to declare that as an interest? Or, yes, okay. So, okay, thank you.
Okay, so another declaration of interest to be made. Okay, so I think that was the decisions of the Shareholder Cabinet Committee. Last item on our agenda is the work programme 22-23. In particular, I think we need to have a look at the contents of the September meeting, just to see what we might carry over from this meeting into that meeting. Dan, any comments?
No, Gina, I've noted down all the actions from the meeting today for the work programme, but as you say, it's for members to look at the work programme and make sure it seems to have the right items on it for the next meeting.
Okay, the one thing that I'd like to just expand for the September meeting, we've got a review of procurement and single tender contracts, And I'd like to just expand that to the role of the tackle company, where we've got a significant amount of money going through a process where no competitive tenders are needed. So I don't know how we make sure that we're getting value for money through that arrangement, but it's a conscious decision that Peterborough have made to have that arrangement, and there are, I think, other councils around the country who have them, and there are risks associated with the way that they work. I don't know any more detail than that, but it feels like something that we just need to dive into while we've got procurement in the room. Okay, if there are any more suggestions for the September agenda, then do let myself or Dan know over the next couple of days. Okay, if there are no more comments or questions on the work agenda, then thank you very much for your time and for your patience. I'm mindful that it is 7:59, so we've only just scraped in, but it's been a very good discussion, and I think we're starting to get under the skin of some of the issues that are here, some of the transparency that were needed. Mike is quite rightly challenging us to be absolutely the best we can, and the question is how fast we can move along that path. But thank you everybody for your attendance today. Thank you.